The U.S. President Donald Trump is expanding his tariff targets, taking aim at Europe. This after reaching a truce with China during the G20 Summit. Let's get a little bit more perspective on the takeaways from the G20. John Baird is a senior advisor at Bennett Jones and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Nice to see you.
Good to be with you.
I mean, we move so fast, a couple of days, it's like we're moving on from G20. But it was that opportunity to get everybody together, and there was a lot of anticipation. What were some of your takeaways from?
Well, as G20 meetings go, this was rather bland. During the synchronized global economic downturn, it was really important at synchronizing economic policy, but not so much anymore. Yeah, they're promoting free and fair trade, but fall short of denouncing protectionism, which is bad. The huge risks of protectionism to the global economy, I think, are real and significant. There was good news on the sidelines. When you get these 20 leaders together, it's an amazing opportunity to have the bilaterals on the sidelines of the conference, and maybe that's even more important than the meeting itself. The fact that they reset China trade discussions, I think, was positive. But the bottom line is Trump really cares about trade, and number one on his target list is China, and his advisors fuel the worst within him.
It's so interesting that you say that. I mean, a G20, I've never said this in my life, but to think of like high-profile wrestling events where you build up all this drama and then you have the main event where they come together, it is a different tone than when we go back to what we're more classically looked at as a crisis period for the economy, where we're all going to come together and try to figure something out. Now it's, what's the body language going to be like with these two countries, which have been saying some pretty nasty things about each other?
Well, you fundamentally have different values and different interests at play. When the G7 gets together, they're all liberal democracies, they're all open, liberal economies. That's not the case with the G20. You have authoritarian regimes, those that embrace liberalism, and those that, frankly, are hostile to it. And Russia is increasingly becoming hostile to Western liberalism and denouncing it at every opportunity, and walking around literally with a bag of wrenches, throwing them in.
And we were trying to figure out, at least in the China-Canada storyline, where would we come out? In the end, the Prime Minister did a sideline meeting. We don't know too much other than him talking about the Canadians who are jailed in China right now. And we also don't really know whether or not President Trump had much to say about Canada in his one-on-one time.
Trust me, if Trump had, in his private meeting with Xi Jinping, the White House would tell us.
We would know
they haven't, he didn't.
Yeah.
The reality is that the relationship has really soured. I mean, I don't know whether it was a pull aside, which is an organized thing, or a brush aside, which means you just ran into the president in the hall. But this relationship in 2015 was very warm, was very strong. We were getting a lot done, and it's really deteriorated. And it's not just deteriorated because of the Huawei arrest and the detention of the two Canadians. Canada was to launch free trade discussions back in December of 17. They didn't when the Prime Minister demanded this progressive trade agenda. The Chinese literally sent him home packing. The non-approval, the blocking of the ACON deal really embarrassed and angered the Chinese. And then finally that NAFTA, anti-China clause in the new NAFTA, USMCA, really annoyed the Chinese.
And, well, it's interesting you mentioned ACON, which has come up a couple of times this morning, because we have Canadian regulators who have been a little bit uneasy, I think, with the terms of this Genworth this deal involving Genworth to get approval from a Chinese company to take it over. So it just feels like there's this narrative building right now on Canada might do its thing when it comes to Chinese businesses coming into Canada, and vice versa, as we've seen over the last few months.
Well, the first thing I would do in terms of Canada-China relations is stop making it worse. That's stop digging when you get to this type of position. I think you need a strategy, and I think even a bad strategy would be better than no strategy. But the relationship continues to deteriorate month after month, and that's obviously not in the long-term interest of Canada. We don't want China to be a new Cold War between our two countries. We want a warm, robust relation. Yeah, go in with eyes wide open. Don't mistake that we have the same values. We have very different values, but I think we do have aligned interests, particularly when it comes to economic growth.
This idea of having a new ambassador I mean, we were talking about that earlier with Peter MacKay. What are your thoughts on that process and why we haven't been able to figure that out to get a new ambassador in place for China?
In fairness to the government, we don't know whether they've been trying to get whether Canada or China has tried to get agreement on a new ambassador. They could be trying and failing, and that could be both ways, just as much with Canada to the Chinese ambassador. Their ambassador is leaving this week.
That's right.
So I think what we need, that would be a great first start, is that we could agree on an exchange agreement on 2 ambassadors. That would be the beginning, hopefully, of warmer relations.
So we talked about how U.S. President Donald Trump has already moved on from, I guess, what we're now calling a truce between China and the U.S. to now targeting a lot of tariff activity at Europe.
I think this is a temporary truce. You know, they're negotiating. They're reinvigorating those negotiations. I think that's a good thing. But he's playing hardball. The scale of the tariffs on American consumers are real and significant. And you know, he really cares about this. Peter Navarro, Robert Lighthizer, his trade representative, they are very tough when it comes to China, and they feed the worst instincts in him. I see this as a huge risk to the global economic economy if this went south. Xi Jinping is strong. He's smart. I've seen this guy up close. He's experienced. When Xi Jinping thinks of the short term, he thinks of the next 5 years. When any Western leader thinks of the short term, they think of the next 5 hours, the next 5 days.
Sure.
And I think the United States is into its toughest trade negotiations ever.
So for those, I mean, the markets, look, we saw it over the weekend, right? Like we come Monday, it's Canadian markets closed, U.S. markets are open, but people say, okay, there's a trade truce, okay, that's good, we'll buy, and the S&P moves up to a new high. This is going to be, there's simply 2 stories for the markets right now. There's what's happening with interest rates and what's happening with the trade tensions. Mm-hmm. So for those who are trying to figure out if the China-U.S. trade truce turns into an outright trade deal, I mean, what would be your odds that
we're close to a trade deal, in my opinion. I hope I'm wrong. But the bottom line is, I mean, if Donald Trump were to leave office today, you see growing protectionism on both sides of the aisle in the United States. The Democrats, and particularly those Democrats on the left, have always been hostile to open markets and free trade, and you're increasingly seeing it on the right, where even senators like the senator from Ohio, was a former U.S. trade representative himself, campaigned against NAFTA when he sought re-election.
So we just got through some new Bloomberg data showing that consumer confidence in this country, even with the trade uncertainty, has been on the rise. And maybe that's because we just saw pipeline approval in this country, and maybe it's because we saw the U.S. move away from metal tariffs directed at Canada, and maybe it's because people have jobs and the housing market is starting to recover. But on this trade issue, what do you think are going to be some of the key issues on the road towards the federal election in this country?
Yeah, I think on trade, the country's doing well. I mean, we had this big debate about globalization and free trade back in '88 and in 1991 to '93. Canadians embrace the world. We see economic engagement with the world to be increasingly part of our future economic prosperity. We're one of the only countries where we don't have a large-scale anti-globalization movement in the mainstream political parties, and we're very blessed on that. I mean, the previous government negotiated, and in fairness to the Trudeau government, they salvaged the European trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. We got a deal on a new NAFTA. So we're very fortunate to have such a wide range of trading opportunities. What we've got to do is we can't continue to put all of our eggs in the basket with the United States. We've got to diversify, particularly in Europe and with the TPP partners.
I mean, that seemed to be fundamentally why we started talking about China a lot more in the first place. Just before you go, the same question about what happens in the language that we hear in the lead up to the federal election when it comes to China. I mean, if you're saying let's not do more damage to that relationship, and yet this is an issue that a lot of Canadians
I think there was very high expectations of this government when they first took office about relationships with China. Obviously, Stephen Harper's government that I was a part of struggled for the first few years, and then established a very balanced and positive, constructive relationship. I think it's obviously one of the biggest foreign policy challenges. But our foreign policy is under we're really struggling. We've had huge problems, obviously, with the United States. Obviously, China, India, the relationship is in a low point, certainly in my lifetime. And obviously, in the Arab world, in Saudi Arabia, it's not gone well. And that doesn't serve our long-term best interests.
All right, John, good to get your perspective. Thanks, as always.
Great to be with you.
John Baird, former Foreign Affairs Minister and Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones, joining us with his take on a very busy trade time.